in the Wall Street Journal of the same morning is an interview with our own most beloved David Mccullough. History gives us a sense of proportion, Mccullough says. It's an aid to navigation in such troubled, uncertain times. History, an aid to navigation in such troubled and uncertain times. I speak to you this evening as an immigrant, as a lawyer, and as a judge who has spent almost 50 years exploring the ebbs and flows, the zigs and zags of the American judicial system. I value personally and deeply our nation's pledge to equal justice under law for all. I believe profoundly in the central place that the rule of law holds in our democracy.
Good evening, and a warm welcome to all of you on this beautiful spring evening. And welcome to Literary Lights, the Associates of the Boston Public Library's 29th annual tribute to the outstanding writers of the Northeast region. Every year, this dinner, like the library itself, evolves, and this year is no exception. In tune with the times, this year I am relinquishing my long-standing duties as MC of this program to Jared Bowen, GBH's Executive Arts Editor. Now, many of you may know Jared as the moderator, if one could call him such, of the series in Symphony Hall, the speaker series. Others of you may be better acquainted with him as the host of Open Studio, which is GBH's award-winning weekly television series that explores creative processes underlying the work of both local and nationally known visual and performing artists. And some of you may simply know him as a regular on Greater Boston and as well Morning Edition and Boston Public Radio, where his reviews of films, theater, performance, dance, and happenings, every imaginable form of artistic expression, make one realize how this once provincial city of ours has become a mecca for artists and a crucible of creativity. Now, I can't think of a more appropriate way to celebrate the library's new and very exciting alliance with WGBH, one of Boston's foremost sources of ideas, images, real news, and inspiration. A partner is firmly committed to the library itself as to the mission of public education, and to have this delightful, insightful young man be the voice and guiding spirit of this evening's program. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you'll join me, in welcoming Jared, but I must tell you something about him, which is that a friend recently revealed to me that when Jared was introducing the politically incorrect comedian John Cleese at Symphony Hall recently, he had an uncharacteristic bout of stage fright. He confessed this to Cleese, who said, "Oh, I have just the cure for this," proceeded to smack Jared twice across the face. Now, I want to reassure you, just as the movie industry says no animals have been harmed, I have not used similar coercive tactics to get Jared up on this stage. So please join me in welcoming Jared.
That is not completely true. There was some slapping, but I have to say I feel better about it because there's a pile of 50 Shades of Grey books on our table, so I'm glad to know we weren't headed in that direction.
Terrible writing. It just would not fly here. It's given pornography a bad name.
Let us thank Vivienne Spiro for her years of service to this event. I know I have epic shoes to fill. So this evening we celebrate and honor a number of our culture's leading literary lights. It's a poignant moment because tonight we link them to the bright lights of the past, to the writers, artists, craftsmen, and thinkers whose legacy will not be extinguished thanks to the work of the Associates of the Boston Public Library. They, of course, are the city's chief guardians of the special collections at the library. The Associates are also the only completely independent nonprofit group that assumes the mantle for raising the funds to ensure that these treasures are cataloged, digitized, conserved, and quite significantly, made available to all. In my humble opinion, and the curator is here tonight, I'm delighted for this, the Boston Public Library presented one of the most extraordinary exhibitions of last year with Shakespeare Unauthorized. It was a show that offered provocative perspectives on Shakespeare. By the way, this is his birthday today, so this is very fitting, yes, which I learned from the exhibit and remembered. It was a show that offered these provocative perspectives and rattled our assumptions, how he was derided in his day, how he borrowed from other works, and how the most famous line in English theater, "To be or not to be, that is the question," may have actually read, "To be or not to be, aye, there's the point." We know and saw all of this right there on real pages because of the Boston Public Library's magnificent holdings, which the Associates, by the way, made possible by being the first to bring the curator on board by paying for the Shakespeare cataloging, conservation, and digitization. I recently reacquainted myself with more of the work of the library's own Raiders of the Lost Ark team, a very small team, I might point out. I saw the work they've done in restoring newly vibrant medieval manuscripts and Audubon prints. I read John Winthrop's Free Man's Oath from 1631, which is the earliest known document referencing voting and democracy in America, which, if anyone wants to help, it does need conserving. I studied Paul Revere's hand-drawn diagram of the Boston Massacre, the only first-hand witness account. I watched new bindings being handcrafted and saw some sleuthing at play, how the team determined a letter by George Washington was actually signed by him, but not actually written by him. And I wish I could recreate for you the zeal and energy with which the staff showed me all of this, their smiles and their pride, although I would say that the hazmat onesie that they made me wear to tour was a bit overkill. I just want to remind you, too, of the treasure chest that is the Boston Public Library Special Collections. Why we're here tonight. 250,000 volumes, 1 million manuscripts, more than 100,000 prints, minus 3 after Wednesday. I'm talking about the recent repatriation efforts from artifacts to Italy, but I think we can now confirm honor as one of the library's accomplishments. Before we begin the formal program, let me just leave you with this. I toured the collections not long after ISIS was again obliterating ancient monuments and artifacts across the Middle East. It reminded me how fortunate we are. These collections are housed here in our great city. It is our fortune to have the work of the literary lights of the past literally at our fingertips. But that fortune also demands that we step up. It is our moral and cultural imperatives to support the care of these works simply because we can. And as that tiny staff would plead to you, there is so much work still to be done. It was soul-crushing to see what happened in the Middle East, so let's not squander our privilege. This isn't a pass-the-hat kind of party, so I'll let you do with that what you will. We'll take a moment to start our dinner, and we'll be back to begin the formal part of our program in just a moment. Thank you. So to begin the evening, it's my great pleasure to introduce the still very fresh and new president of the Boston Public Library, David Leonard. He has already demonstrated that he's a visionary leader, opening a radically reimagined library just down the street that's drawn a surge in public attention and interest. He's also put its contents in the public eye, hiring a preservation librarian, securing more than $15 million in city funding for the renovation of both the Rare Book Reading Room and a conservation lab. And he's ensured that we will still have a comprehensive inventory of the library's staggering collection of prints and drawings. And the good news is, he's just getting started. David will be introducing our keynote speaker, a woman for whom I have a great deal of professional and personal affection, the first female justice See, I bungled it. I was so intimidated by her, I bungled it. I knew this would happen. So sorry. The first female Chief Justice of the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court, and that, of course, is the Honorable Margaret Marshall. Please welcome David Leonard.
Thank you, Jared, and thank you, Vivienne. Good evening. Our mission at the library today is to celebrate reading and writing, community spaces and programs, preservation of our cultural heritage, and robust services for the pursuit of knowledge and truth, all of which remains free to all today as it was 170 years ago. I offer greetings this evening on behalf of Mayor Walsh, whose continuing commitment to the library is reflected in a strong budget for the upcoming fiscal year. And coupled with increased support from the associates, all of you, our supporters and friends, the future is bright for this library as part of a healthy, thriving, and innovative city. It is a beacon of light in times that are troubling to many, both economically and socially. Thank you for all that you do, and we hope will continue to make possible. Tonight, we celebrate the importance of writing in many forms and genres. Writing matters, writing has impact, and some writing, such as that found in the majority opinions of a Supreme Court justice, can matter in a particularly meaningful way. It is now my duty and privilege to introduce tonight's awardee and keynote speaker, Chief Justice Margaret Marshall. Biography is important, and Margaret Marshall's life is punctuated by stories of great struggle in the face of civil adversity, from student activism in the apartheid world of South Africa, an inspired visit by Bobby Kennedy that ultimately led to her immigration to the US, a great legal career which includes stints as general counsel to Harvard University, the first woman to be named Senior Fellow of the Yale Corporation, and of most note to many of us, her appointment as Chief Justice of the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court. She is the second woman to serve on the Supreme Court and the first to serve as Chief Justice in its more than 300-year history. In the course of her term, she wrote hundreds of opinions and wrote the landmark decision of the last decade in Goodrich versus the Department of Health that declared the Massachusetts Constitution does not permit the state to deny citizens the right to same-sex marriage. While we will stipulate to these great accomplishments and the stature of this great woman, I also want to introduce you to the person. This is the same person who recently came to our rare books department for a 30-minute visit and stayed for an hour and a half, poring over Paul Revere's sketch of the Boston Massacre and John Adams' own copy of the US Constitution. Her friends liberally share stories of a warm, smart woman of incredible humility and a dry sense of humor. And while I was told stories of shipping furniture and china from Hong Kong many decades ago and a certain Super Bowl party, let me leave you with just two quotes from close friends. First, if she is your friend, you will not find a better friend than Margie Marshall. And second, if it is possible to be a genius on the emotional intelligence spectrum, then Margie is a true genius. And so in closing, in the words of the Goodrich decision, our obligation is to define the liberty of all, not to mandate our own moral code. Ladies and gentlemen, please rise and join me in welcoming to the podium our keynote speaker, our friend, our empathetic civil leader, Chief Justice Margaret Marshall.
Thank you, David, for those wonderful remarks. Let me just say two things to begin with. First, anything that comes in a turquoise box with a white ribbon is just fine with me. And second, Jared Bowen, if every good-looking man lost their voice when they saw me, I'd be much better off. I've been at this wonderful event several times, and it is so great to be back with so many friends, but I do have an initial request. This is a great hotel, and it does great things for great institutions in Boston, and its sound system is terrible. So I'm going to ask the people at the sort of four corners that if you can't hear, please just tell me, because I would like you to hear what I have to say. And it's always difficult at this evening. I'm particularly pleased to be here, and David, thank you for those very generous remarks, and I think I know to whom you speak, and they will pay dearly. But I am pleased to be here in the place where the conservation of the original works of some of my personal heroes, and those of you who know me well know that John Adams is certainly my personal hero, have found a loving home in the rare books department of a great library. In fact, I, and indeed all of us, owe an enormous gratitude to the Boston Public Library for its tireless work collecting and preserving and now transmitting the vibrant history of our Commonwealth and our nation. But tonight we celebrate something even more special: the Associates of the Boston Public Library, led by Wonder Woman Vivienne Spiro. And Vivienne, where are you? Right here. Vivienne, please stand. Vivienne really is a wonder, and the only advice I have for all of you is don't give her your cell number. But as Vivienne and all of the associates, the co-chairs, the wonderful co-chairs of tonight's evening, and for each of you for supporting the incredible work that the associates and the independent financial support that they give to David and his colleagues to enable us to continue to do what we do. So thank you all for being here. Okay, so just tell me if I stand closer, does that help? Yes. Okay. Easter Sunday, 2017, 2 different newspapers and 2 items catch my eye. The first, in the Dallas Morning News, is a cartoon. Sean Spicer, drawn as a small boy, sits on the floor in a corner, his legs straight out ahead of him, and reading a large volume propped up on his legs. History, the volume is titled. Wow, says Sean Spicer. The second, in the Wall Street Journal. Thank you. The second, in the Wall Street Journal of the same morning, is an interview with our own most beloved David Mccullough. History gives us a sense of proportion, Mccullough says. It's an aid to navigation in such troubled, uncertain times. History, an aid to navigation in such troubled and uncertain times. I speak to you this evening as an immigrant, as a lawyer, and as a judge who has spent almost 50 years exploring the ebbs and flows, the zigs and zags of the American judicial system. I value personally and deeply our nation's pledge to equal justice under law for all. I believe profoundly in the central place that the rule of law holds in our democracy. I came from South Africa, as David said, where I knew just the opposite. That wasn't because judges in South Africa were necessarily biased in favor of apartheid, although many were. I grew up there, and I was educated there. And black personhood was legally inferior to white personhood. Identity cards, censorship, state attacks on intellectuals, armed police vehicles confronting unarmed protesters, imprisonment and solitary confinement, itself a form of torture, the killings of political dissenters. This was the stuff of everyday life for the majority of South Africans, where disagreement with the apartheid system was itself criminally punished as a crime. The judges, I said, were not necessarily in favor of their system, And why did they uphold those laws? Why did they sentence people to prison? Why did they refuse to let people who had been arrested decline to come to court? Fundamentally, it was because South Africa followed the British system, the British model of government, the system of parliamentary supremacy, and under that system, judges must uphold the laws enacted by Parliament, broadly speaking. South Africa's Parliament enacted a great many oppressive laws, and judges were compelled to enforce them. Perhaps this audience, steeped as many of you are in American history, will recognize the parliamentary model I have just described, but I have to tell you very few Americans do, and they do not understand the difference between that system and our structure of government. But certainly the British parliamentary system is the model that our founders emphatically rejected when devising their own form of government. And at the center of that transformation was John Adams, the draft of the Massachusetts Constitution, the oldest in our nation, and some of whose most important writings are preserved in the Boston Public Library in its rare books department. The Massachusetts Constitution, as many of you know, begins with a wonderful declaration, ringing declaration of rights. All people are born free and equal and have certain natural, essential, and unalienable rights. But how to secure those rights? In the Massachusetts Constitution, Adams devised a radical solution, and one never before implemented in human history, to the executive, well-known, and the legislative branches. He added a third, independent, co-equal judicial branch comprised of judges, in the words of his Constitution, as free, impartial, and independent as the lot of humanity will admit. And it was those judges who were charged with enforcing the natural rights of every person. Adams' scheme sounded great on paper, but would it work? In 1783, as many of you know, just 3 years after the Massachusetts Constitution took effect, the Supreme Judicial Court heard the first constitutional case. It concerned the savage beating of a black man, Quock Walker, by or at the behest of Nathaniel Jennison, a white man. Jennison claimed that Walker was his slave, his property, and had run away. Walker, in turn, claimed that he had been promised his freedom. And the slave took the extraordinary step of suing Jennison. The legal question in the case came down to this: was Walker the property of his slave master? And at a time when slavery was widely endorsed and routinely practiced, the question, I have to tell you, was far from obvious. How fortunate we are that Chief Justice William Cushing's original notes in that 1783 have been carefully preserved by the Massachusetts Historical Society. And I want to quote from his notes, which move me even as I speak this evening. Our constitution of government, by which the people of this Commonwealth have solemnly bound themselves, declares that all men are born free and equal, and that every subject is entitled to liberty to have it guarded by the laws. This being the case, though, Chief Justice Cushing, I think the idea of slavery is inconsistent with our conduct and constitution, and there can be no such thing as perpetual servitude of a rational creature. The Supreme Judicial Court looked to and enforced the words of the Massachusetts Constitution, upsetting hundreds of years of settled law and custom in the process. Adams's Constitution had indeed worked. And while Quock Walker was pleading his case in Massachusetts, our national government was floundering, the Articles of Confederation unraveling, and the men who met at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia were particularly drawn to the Massachusetts scheme of government and its impartial, co-equal judicial branch. It was, as we all now know, a structure that was later adopted in our federal constitution. The proposal to adopt the Adams model on a national scale was daring. We cannot find one express prototype in the experience of the world, James Madison wrote, and for the longest time, the United States stood in splendid isolation in its adoption of this wholly new form of democracy. But from the ashes of the World War II, the rubble of communism, and the collapse of colonialism, new constitutional democracies have taken place across the globe. From Slovenia to South Africa, from Uruguay to Hungary, following in the footsteps of John Adams, and each new constitution contains a bill or a charter of rights and the constitutional authority of independent judges to enforce those rights, even when limiting the democratic will of the majority. No parliamentary system are these. We can, and we do, celebrate those developments. But a convergence of equally potent developments in our own country, however, seems to be moving in the opposite direction and is deeply troubling. Pointed attacks by pundits and leading politicians, including those holding high public office, on judges for being out of step with political trends, a massive influx of special interest money into judicial selection and retention procedures, and the upending of the rules for the appointment of a Supreme Court justice. These are a toxic mixture that undermines the central premise of our democracy. Recently, our national attention has been focused on the selection of a new justice for our federal Supreme Court. But the health of the entire legal system, both state and federal, depends on a strong state judiciary. These are not my words, but those of former United States Supreme Court Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, perhaps one of the most beloved justices. State court judges, no less than their federal colleagues, must be independent, free from influence. But two recent decisions, one of which you may not be familiar with, Republican Party against Minnesota, decided in 2002, and the more familiar Citizens United against Federal Election Commission, decided in 2010, paved the way for state judicial electioneering that threatens that independence. In White, the Supreme Court held in essence that the First Amendment gives sitting judges and judicial candidates the right to make clear their own personal and political views on legal matters that come before them. The results of that decision: in many jurisdictions, judicial candidates now ardently commit themselves to rule in a certain way. What they think of abortion, for example, or whether they will always impose the death penalty in certain types of cases. Implicit in our constitutional compact is the guarantee that judges will give each person a fair hearing, will consider only the evidence presented in court, and will not look outside the court to reach a decision. White and its progeny strain this compact to its limits. This is new in the United States. This is new, and this is a dangerous development. And Citizens United against Federal Election Commission poured oil onto the fires already burning in state judiciaries across this country. Almost all of the commentary has focused on the consequences of that decision for presidential or congressional races. The less heralded consequence for judicial elections are even more troubling. In his powerful dissent, Justice Stevens wrote, "States may no longer have the ability to place modest limits on corporate electioneering, even if they believe such limits to be critical to maintaining the integrity of their judicial systems." His little-noticed observation was prescient. And the rewriting of the rules for the appointment of a Supreme Court justice, culminating in the confirmation of Justice Neil Gorsuch, has done little to shake the public's view that all judges decide all cases based on their own political preferences. Making an existing Supreme Court vacancy a highly visible part of an electoral strategy stamps the court as an electoral prize, pure and simple. In doing so, it places the court in a position of real institutional peril. Those are the words of Linda Greenhouse, perhaps the most perceptive observer of the court in our generation. The deans of Harvard and Yale law schools jointly recently reminded us, law overrides violence with reason. Law stands for what we have in common, not merely what divides us. Law respects disagreement. It patiently considers evidence and advocacy. It engages with the views of all. Each person, not just each citizen, is equal before the law. Equality before the law, that is the special gift given to us when our country adopted a constitutional democracy in 1787. Justice Sandra Day O'Connor has voiced her own concern about, and I quote, the efforts of those who would strong-arm the judiciary into adopting their preferred policies. It takes a lot of degeneration before a country falls into dictatorship, she said, but we should avoid these ends by avoiding these beginnings. We should indeed avoid these ends by avoiding these beginnings. And you and me, each of us, owe it to the generations who follow to protect this special gift. Thank you.
It's my privilege now to present the presenters who will present tonight's lights. He has authored or co-authored 21 books. He's created 15 documentaries. He surely needs steel beams to support this display of all his awards, which include a Peabody, DuPont, Emmy, and NAACP Image Award. He was in the first class of Genius Grant winners, has received 55 honorary degrees, so the only thing left for Harvard professor, filmmaker, journalist, and cultural critic Henry Louis Gates Jr. to do is to present 2017 Literary Light, Kwame Anthony Appiah.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. Can you all hear me in the far reaches of this room? So you might say that I was introduced to Anthony Appiah long before we actually met in October 1973. Having graduated from Yale the previous June, I found myself embarking upon my graduate education at the University of Cambridge, assigned to Clare College, where Paul Mellon, who endowed our fellowship, had matriculated. Like most Americans, I would suppose, I was determined to see two things at Cambridge as soon as I could. The first was the rooms where John Milton had lived when he was a student in the late 1620s at Christ College. As I looked on in awe, the tour guide abruptly turned to me and, apropos of nothing, suddenly asked me if I knew Anthony Appiah. I don't believe so, I responded, and I continued the tour. A few days later, I went to visit the rooms where Isaac Newton had lived in Trinity College in the early 1660s. This time, it was a fellow student who tapped me on the shoulder during the tour, again, apropos of absolutely nothing, and asked if I knew someone named Anthony Appiah. Well, no, I responded, wondering why this question had been asked again. Back at Clare, my dorm in effect, over dinner the next night, I was asked this question for a third time. A day or so later, as I was walking through the old court at Clare, I looked across the manicured lawn and saw a thin young black man with a mane of curly black hair poking its way out from under the very wide brim of a very large white hat. I looked at him, I walked up to him, and I said, "I bet your name's Anthony Appiah." It's a true story. after he recovered from the shock, the young man asked me how in the world I knew his name. I explained that I had been asked if I knew him at least 3 times in my first week at Cambridge, and for that there could be only one possible explanation. Whoever this Anthony Appiah character was, he had to be a black man, since white people only ask a black person if they know someone if that person happens to be black too. When I heard his hearty laughter in response, I knew that I had met a man who would become a friend. Since his years at Cambridge and his earliest years teaching in Ghana and at Yale, Kwame Anthony Appiah has approached with the rarest combination of rigor and humanity the philosophy of mind and language, political philosophy, and African American intellectual history. Appiah, as a thinker and writer, is urbane and warm, scholarly and accessible, challenging and generous. His work crosses disciplines as it spans the globe, celebrating human rights, ethnic and cultural pluralism, individual identity, and liberty and reason. His many award-winning books have helped to reshape how we see our multicultural world and ourselves in that world. His loyal readership and multiple honors suggest that I'm not alone in thinking of him as one of the best teachers in the academy and in our broader public discourse. In 2017, he'll publish 2 books, As If, Idealization and Ideals, based on the American Philosophical Association's Karas Lectures of 2013, and Mistaken Identities, based on his riveting 2016 Wreath Lectures. He is a novelist as well. He's published 3 novels. And he's published the book of African Proverbs with his estimable beloved mother, Peggy Appiah, a scion of a titled English family who married the Ghanaian nationalist and founding father, Joe Appiah. Appiah's writing reflects the wide cosmopolitan world in which he was raised, in which he lives, and through which he extensively travels. A world of difference in which he always somehow seems to be at home. Anthony has written so much and so well that it's difficult to pull one line or paragraph that sums up both the generosity and incisiveness of his thought, but here's something that speaks very clearly to me in his voice. In Experiments in Ethics, he wrote, and I quote, "Yet in making our choices, we must sometimes start with a vision, however inchoate, of what it is for a human life to go well. It's my argument," he continues, "that we should be free to avail ourselves of the resources of many disciplines to define that vision, and that in bringing them together, we are being faithful to a long tradition. In the humanities," he continues, "I think, we are always engaged in illuminating the present by drawing on the past. It's the only way to make a future worth hoping for," unquote. Anthony Appiah has that rare ability to talk with the most erudite philosophers who theorize about being in the world, but also with regular people who are in the world. How many great thinkers can translate the complexities of their discipline into words simple and clear enough to guide us when real moral choices have to be made in our daily lives? After all, helping people to live ethically and to improve their lives is, or should be, shouldn't it, the goal of the humanities, to mend the world by fashioning the tools needed to confront the difficult choices we face each day, as he has begun to do through his delightful weekly ethicist column in the New York Times Magazine. Knowing the right thing to do is part of a larger framework within which people have been wrestling at least since Socrates. Anthony draws ethical thought out of its golden cage, and in doing so, guides us through what we need to do every day as we work toward being good, being decent, and being humane. What can I say about Anthony Appiah all these years after I first met him in his broad-brimmed white cowboy hat in Clare College, Cambridge? I can say that he cares about people even more than he cares about ideas, and that he cares about real human beings even more than that abstraction we call humanity. It was he so long ago who did so much by his example to inspire me to dream the dream of living the life of the mind. And the constancy of his loving friendship has sustained and enriched my life for the last 4.5 decades. He is a sublime example of the thinker equally at home in the academy and in the world, a person who, to paraphrase Terence, is so at home in his own skin that no one's skin color is alien to him. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor to present to you the philosopher and man of letters, Kwame Anthony Appiah.
I'm actually reminded of what LBJ said after another gentleman from West Virginia, Senator Jennings Randolph, introduced him in an equally generous way. Randolph said, "I wish my mother and father might have been here to hear that introduction, because my father would have enjoyed hearing what you have to say about me, and my mother would have believed it." And Skip knew them both, so he knows what I'm talking about. Really, though, I spent my teenage years with a bunch of buddies, but no best friend. And then 40-something years ago, I met Skip, and I've had a best friend ever since. The other person I'd like to thank, and he's going to be very upset with me, is my best critic and editor, my husband, Henry Finder, who's been my partner for almost as long. Over the years at the office, he's edited Skip, John Updike, Malcolm Gladwell, Adam Gopnik, Atul Gawande, Larissa McFarquhar, and a host of other wonderful writers. So I want to apologize in front of all of you for making him continue to work when he comes home in the evening, helping me, as I say, as my best editor and critic. Of course, I feel deeply honored to be among tonight's Literary Lights, and I'm very grateful to all of you who organized this for inviting me. It was suggested that my remarks should be brief, but maybe funny, which is no small challenge when it comes to talking about libraries. So I went to the reference librarian at NYU. I'm a scholar, I know how to solve any problem, you just ask a reference librarian. And I asked her if she could tell me a good joke about a librarian. And she fixed me with a basilisk stare and replied, "My salary." But the truth is, if you're a writer like me, libraries are not a joke. They're at the heart of what we do. I remember as a child in Ghana how our home, with its few thousand books, served as a library for all the kids of our neighborhood who would come at my mother's invitation. So in a certain sense, I grew up in a library. Like the authors and editors and publishers who make books and journals happen, libraries are essential to the ecology that helps us writers find readers. From kids with no books at home, to immigrants looking to make sense of a new country, to unemployed people looking for jobs, to writers doing research, to citizens trying to evaluate elected officials, these temples to the book, to a whole range of media, are essential to literature, to scholarship, and as Margie just reminded us, to democracy. So thank you very much, Boston Public Library.
Next, I'm pleased to welcome to the stage one of the legendary voices and intellects of public radio. He is someone who has promoted civic conversation about the most pressing issues and ideas of our time, just like many of the authors we're hearing from this evening. Christopher Lydon is the host of Open Source on WBUR and presents Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Susan Faludi.
Thank you, Jared. Thank you, everybody. I want to just begin spontaneously saying up with the immigrants, including Anthony Appiah and Margie Marshall, and up with the public library of the city of Boston, built by the people for the advancement of learning. I like even better on the Boylston Street side, the Commonwealth requires the education of the people as the safeguard of order and liberty. It's a complete constitution right there. Let me just say, I have not known Susan Faludi for 30 years. She's not my best friend, but I'm here to tell you, to my taste anyway, she is the long-form journalist in our time. And I mean that very seriously from the heart, as a reader from the beginning since Backlash. You know, the artists say it's not about the answers, it's about the questions. And nobody pursues the questions more sure-footedly, more seriously, more conscientiously, more doggedly, but more intelligently, dare I say, than Susan Faludi. As in, for example, the question she asked her father, born Istvan, I'm sorry, my computer died an ignominious death today. I'm reading from notes, but Istvan Friedman, who became, in Nazi time, Stephen Faludi, and then, many years later, became Steffi after a surgical transformation. And Susan, after a quarter century of estrangement, met him in Hungary and wrote this now classic masterpiece, In the Darkroom. But among her questions, the central one was really, what does it mean? What does it mean to dispense with, say goodbye to, those people that one has known and been all one's life? I read that book in a kind of fear and trembling, not fear exactly, but trembling, and not so much for the father as for the daughter, working her way through this examination, very much like, truly like a doctor, like a great diagnostician trying to undo the mystery here. Her father said at some point to Susan's husband, she's a shy, soft-spoken girl, a gentle girl, and then she really pulls out the gun. And Susan responded, I think it was in The Guardian, that it's what her father really needed, that he wanted, more than anything, he wanted to be perceived, as we all do, and surely as that book does. Susan Faludi graduated Harvard Summa in 1981. Then the book that stands up incredibly well, Backlash, about the push against feminism. And then, sort of equal time for the guys, Stiffed, The Betrayal of the American Man. Then The Terror Dream, Fear and Fantasy in Post 9/11 America, which we're still living through. And then last year, this masterpiece. Susan does not shy from pain or painful subjects. She's also capable of saying that the epidemic in our time is self-pity among people who are not suffering as much as they imagine they are. And I think that includes a lot of us in this room. Short form, we're in a kind of strange eclipse of serious journalism, but I think in the long term, there's nobody who exemplifies it, who practices it, who models it. No better ornament to real journalism than Susan Faludi. Thank you.
Wow, this is a very warm bath. It's just, can we just do this every night? This would be it. And I can't think of a more perfect and a more reassuring person to be matched with tonight than Chris. And everything that Chris was saying about journalism goes back times two to him. Last summer, he did the very first interview about in the darkroom with me, and frankly, I was a quivering bowl of Jell-O. Talking about personal stuff is not my thing, which I guess I should have thought about before I wrote this book. But miraculously, Chris got a wonderful discussion out of me, which won't surprise anyone who knows his on-air brilliance and also his off-air brilliance. And I can't think of a more perfect cause for me to be matched with than the preservation of a library and the library's collections. Some years ago, I had a Radcliffe Fellowship, and the very first day, the staff announced that they had a great new perk that they were offering the fellows. Students had been hired to collect our books for us at the library so we wouldn't have to go there ourselves. And I thought, why would I appoint a surrogate to go to heaven? Libraries have been my heaven since I was a kid, and I would spend the summers holed up in my local branch library. The Yorktown Library had an annual reading contest where you'd get a construction paper cutout of various, fruits and vegetables, depending on how many books you had checked out. And I was the proud recipient of a paper pomegranate at the end of the summer, the highest honor. Sometimes I think that everything I've done of merit was done in a library. I wrote Backlash in the San Francisco Public Library. I wrote Stift in the Pasadena Public Library, in the genealogy room, because it had this one big table and you could close the door. But in my litany of heavens, I have to put the Boston Public Library in the top rank. Much of this book, In the Dark Room, was written under the green lamps in the old reading room. With full appreciation and irony, the book that the Associates of the Boston Public Library have so kindly invited me here tonight to celebrate is only a book thanks to the Boston Public Library. As you all support the utterly crucial work of preserving the collections, please remember that you are also supporting not just a repository for those collections and not just the preservation of the collections themselves, but you are also offering a kind of incubator like you'd find in a maternity ward. Because there are a lot of creative lives that wouldn't be alive at all without that space. So I just want to thank you and thank the Associates for the Public Library for your incredible commitment to that, and thank you for this great honor. Thanks.
By the way, I should mention that Vivienne, this vicious rumor is spreading that Vivienne is stepping down. That is not at all the case. I am merely the Ed McMahon to her Johnny Carson. Just to be clear, Vivienne is going nowhere. As we continue on honoring our lights now, must-read New Yorker writer Jill Lepore wrote about Wonder Woman in 2014, and that could easily be the title of any biography written about her one day. She can address any topic with absolute brilliance and elan and makes history searing, from the weighty in New York burning, liberty, slavery, and conspiracy in 18th century Manhattan, to the epically curious, like Joe Gould's teeth. The Harvard University professor prevents her friend and Harvard colleague, Jane Kaminsky.
It's a real honor to present Jane Kaminsky to you all. I first met Jane the very first day of graduate school at Yale. She was wearing this big white cowboy hat. I've known Jane for a long time, and we've done a lot of things together. We started a magazine together once. We were in a dissertation group together once that I won't mention the name of. We wrote a novel together once. We've raised our children together. And I just, for the record, want to clear one thing up, because sometimes there's a question about this, a little bit of ambiguity. Jane is the funny one. Jane Kaminsky has a painter's eye, a scholar's mind, and a novelist's pen. I don't know any other historian as smart or as shrewd. She is also a best beloved friend. Jane has written about many things, gossip and scandal, love and war, but I like it best when she writes about people's lives, the traps into which we fall, and our scrambles to escape. She once described her first book, A Study of the Politics of Speech in Early New England, as an exercise in historical eavesdropping. But no one listens better in the quiet of the archives to the nimble-tongued, the unquiet, the glib-mouthed, the biting stinging of dead men's speech, or better tells the story of people like Anne Hutchinson and the misgovernment of this woman's tongue. A story that Jane writes left in its wake ripples of feminine dissent, nevertheless still persisting. The Exchange Artist is her account of the rise and very terrible fall of a man named Andrew Dexter, who built in Boston at the beginning of the 19th century the tallest building in the United States, the Exchange Coffee House, on a pyramid scheme. The pyramid collapsed, Dexter fled the country, and the building burned to the ground. There are lessons here about dreams and crimes, about the line between risk and folly. But what I love about this beautiful book is Jane's compassion for the scoundrel who is its subject. In one of the small mercies of an otherwise bleak middle age, she writes, "Fate spared Andrew Dexter the sight of the Exchange Coffee House in flames." It's a quiet moment of biographical tenderness. Biography imposes conditions, Virginia Woolf once observed, and those are that it must be based on fact. Jane Kaminsky is an unrivaled finder of facts in the archives. She's a master detective, but she's also a master storyteller. 10 years ago, when we wrote a novel together, I saw this close up. We took turns writing chapters. It was sort of like playing a very long and exhausting game of tennis. The novel had 2 narrators, so we'd email each other chapters midweek. I'd send her a chapter on Wednesday, she'd send me a chapter back on Saturday. And we had no, the novelists are all aghast, we had no plot in mind or anything. We had no plan. So it really just happened to be responding to one another. And Jane would always make everything more suspenseful and more interesting and scarier and more tense. And I would forever, then I'd get the chapter and everything would have kind of gone wrong, and I would tidy everything up. I would let the lovers kiss. I would let the dog have a bone. I would tuck in all the children to bed and sing them a lullaby and send my chapter back. And she would send me the next chapter and everything would be all screwed up again, and it would always be better. Because Jane always knew better. She always does know better. Which gets me to Jane's latest book, A Revolution in Color, a biography of John Singleton Copley, a portrait of a painter, a fragile, ambitious man of soaring talent, a painter of the sons of liberty who craved nothing so much as the patronage of the king and loved nothing so much as his art and his family. Copley's name is all over this city where he was born, on the wrong side of the docks. But as Jane's masterpiece of a biography reveals, Copley only ever wanted to leave Boston for a wider world, to leave behind portrait painting too, for the painting of history. I learned from this story what I've learned from Jane in so many ways over so many years. We are all of us marked by the books that we read, by the libraries that we visit, by the art we see, by the families we create, by the friends we make, and by our times. In 1765, in his house on Cambridge Street, Copley painted his half-brother with a pet squirrel, a flying squirrel, hitched to a golden chain, his little brother holding this tiny pet squirrel, the tamed animal eyeing his escape. Just yesterday, Jane, not wearing a cowboy hat, went to New York and got that flying squirrel tattooed onto her arm, an emblem of the unchaining of the artist. It is my great privilege to honor Jane Kaminsky.
I can't even think what my career would be had I not met Jill Lepore in the dog park by the Yale Divinity School in 1988. We have raised families and written books and painted rooms and cane chairs and raised and buried dogs together, at least one of whom has a role in Blind Spot. So thank you, Jill, for making me laugh and cry in that introduction. And it's true about the tattoo, actually. It's better than a sports car or a second marriage. So thank you She's the funny one. Thank you to Jill and to Vivienne, Spiro, and Louisa Stevens and the associates of the BPL for this lovely evening. As I was mulling what I might say in my allotted 2 minutes to convey the importance of the associates' work preserving and digitizing rare and unique materials in the BPL special collections, it shocked me to realize, and somewhat embarrassed me to realize, that I have written, if you count the novel Blind Spot with Jill, 4 books about Boston, about Boston's colonial and revolutionary history, books in which the city itself is a major character, and all of which have sent me to the Manuscripts reading room here. There were times in the writing of Blind Spot that Jill and I moved our fingers around the Bonner map, actually trying to walk that 1764 city. Spanning the 17th to the early 19th century, all of my Boston projects have centered on outsiders in the little peninsular town, which at that point was about 1 mile long and half a mile wide. And if all of us are writing to different degrees books about ourselves, that's my story in Boston too. I've been here for 24 years and it's never really quite felt like the place that I'm from. And Andrew Dexter, the exchange artist, was my father, and John Singleton Copley is my mother. All of those outsiders, from slanderers and condemners of authority in John Winthrop's would-be City on a Hill to John Singleton Copley, who saw the self-proclaimed cradle of American liberty as a cradle of mob tyranny. Following them, I thought allowed me to present a clear-eyed and sometimes even a jaundiced view of our city, to poke at its pretensions, and to point out the ways that the messy facts of everyday life often belied its high moral tone. But here's the thing. None of those stories could be told without the elusive primary material to lay the facts bare. Those in my profession are so fortunate that Bostonians possessed from the very beginning not only overweening moral confidence, but equally overweening historical consciousness. As my students would say, they wrote shit down. And institutions like the Boston Public Library have tended that stuff so that scholars like me and Jill could come along someday and play Boston off against itself. And the associates of the BPL supply the resources that these extraordinary collections deserve and demand, which makes me all the more grateful to serve this evening as one of your standard bearers. Thank you so much.
I think that Chief Justice Marshall said that she wanted to show off her tattoo now as well. Is that correct? I misheard that? No. Later? Okay. I'll see you downstairs. This guy, Andre Dubus, is someone men and women want to be and be with. He is quintessential cool, and his writing, it's sublime. Andre is the author of 6 books, including House of Sand and Fog and Dirty Love, which I just love to say. His astonishing memoir, Townie, will have you reeling as you reconcile the extent of his emotional endurance and you consider the extent of your own. He presents 2017 Literary Light, Wally Lamb.
Okay, which glasses? James Baldwin reminds us famously that the purpose of art is to lay bare the questions hidden by the answers. I want to thank all of you lovely human beings out there for your generous support of this essential institution, without which the laying bare of these questions can't happen. I want to give you a round of applause. Thank you. For my happy duty tonight, ever since I picked up and read Wally Lamb's 1992 debut novel, the heartbreakingly beautiful She's Come Undone, I have been an ardent admirer of his work. Here is just a taste of that novel's unforgettable protagonist, Dolores Price. I was on the brown plaid sofa watching TV and scotch taping my bangs to my forehead because Jeanette said that kept them from drying frizzy. Across the room on the Barker lounger, my mother was having her nervous breakdown. Ma sat hunched over one of our fold-out TV trays, working constantly on a religious jigsaw puzzle without making any progress. She wore her knee socks and her quilted pink bathrobe despite the early summer heat. She ate nothing but cubes of Kraft caramels. For 2 weeks, I had been reaching over and turning up the volume, trying as best I could to ignore the private curse words. She began chuckling to herself, trying not to see the litter of caramel cellophane that was accumulating around her chair in a kind of half circle. Here, with spare but immensely evocative prose, you sense the author disappearing into his characters as fully as does a master actor, capturing them without judgment, his primary creative fuel, a deeply compassionate curiosity. And over the course of his substantial career and his 6 acclaimed and best-selling novels, Wally Lamb consistently shows himself to be unafraid to take on large and difficult subject matter. Whether it's the ravages of paranoid schizophrenia, chaos theory and the horror of mass shootings, racial strife, and devastating floodwaters, Wally Lamb seems to enter the blank canvas of each of his novels with a courageous, life-loving, and frankly towering humanity. It is not always the case, of course, that a writer's finest attributes on the page are also evident in his or her life. But that is certainly the case with Wally Lamb, for he is also a gifted, generous, and lifelong teacher. Since 1999 alone, he has run a writing program for incarcerated women at the York Correctional Institute in Niantic, Connecticut, resulting in 2 important collections of essays by these inmates. Couldn't Keep It to Myself, Testimonies from Our Imprisoned Sisters, and I'll Fly Away, further testimonies from the women of York Prison, both of these edited by Mr. Lamb. I wish I had more time to say all I would like to say about my friend Wally Lamb, for I consider him a national treasure, and it is a joy and an honor for me to present him with a status he has carried with grace and humility for many years now, that of literary light. Ladies and gentlemen, Wally Lamb.
You should all immediately lower your expectations. Well, first of all, I wanted to say that I am so mad at Men's Warehouse. You know, I'm more of a sweatshirt guy than a tux guy. And when I went to put this thing on today, the shirt was way too tight and the pants were way too big. So you'll just have to put up with that. I wanted to say thank you so much to the associates of the Boston Public Library for this honor, and more so for the important nonprofit work that you all do. I believe I speak not only for my fellow honorees and presenters here tonight, but for all writers and teachers and scholars and readers when I acknowledge our deeply felt gratitude for your mission of preservation. And thank you, Andre, my literary brother from a different mother. It's a thrill for me to be receiving this honor from one of the country's best contemporary novelists and memoirists. And if you have not had the pleasure of reading Townie, which Jared mentioned before, you're in for a treat. It's a heartbreaking and triumphant story. I too was a townie, a native of another working-class New England town, Norwich, Connecticut. Unlike the residents of Gold Coast, Connecticut on the New York side of things, we townies who grew up east of the Connecticut River tend to be more feisty than fashionable, more liverwurst than pâté, and certainly more Red Sox than Yankees. And so to get this award from Andre Debuse is wicked pissa. I mean, it's like the writer's equivalent of hitting a dinger over there at Fenway Park. The first time I ever got a writing award was in June of 1964 at my 8th grade graduation from Kelly Junior High School, when Miss Higgins, the scary teacher standing at the microphone at the front of the gymnasium/auditorium, announced my name as the recipient of the Julia Pease Award. I was only half listening. Someone on my right elbowed me in the ribs and said, "That's you, numbnuts, get up there." Confused, I stood, took the long perp walk up to the front of the auditorium, shook Miss Higgins' liver-spotted hand, and was handed an envelope in which I later found a crisp, newly printed $5 bill. I figured somebody had made a mistake in having selected me, so later on that same day at the arcade in New London's Ocean Beach Park, I blew the whole wad on skee-ball and whack-a-mole, figuring that if the money was spent, I wasn't probably going to be expected to give it back. Many years later, when Oprah Winfrey called our home to tell me that she had picked that first novel, She's Come Undone, as the 4th selection of her wildly successful Oprah's Book Club, I was skeptical. Oh yeah, you're Oprah, all right. I'm Geraldo Rivera. Thank God this was something that I just thought about saying, not something I actually said. And when she called back the following year to say she had selected my second novel, I know this much is true for her 17th book club selection, I was much cooler this time. Oprah, darling, how are you? How's the weather out there in Chicago? What's new with Dr. Phil? But this newfound self-confidence was short-lived. Out on the road on book tour with that very same novel, I was in my hotel room ironing my pants for that night's reading and watching Jeopardy when I heard Alex Trebek say, "He wrote the novel She's Come Undone." And those 3 poor, schlubby contestants stood there lockjawed, eager but unable to press those thumbs to those buzzers. And so, standing at the ironing board in room 500 and something in some Marriott hotel in some city, in some state, I can't recall, I said rather sheepishly, "Who is Wally Lamb?" Now, to answer that question, I just want to say I'm a guy who has had a whole lot to be humble about and grateful for. And all of this good fortune, this karma, has accorded me. What I am most grateful for is the opportunity to share my life with my former high school friend who became my bride of the past 39 years, and our kids. So, whatever is in that aqua box there back of me, Chris, I share this honor with you. You'll have to dust it, but hey, I love you, Chris, and I love everybody here. Thank you so much.
Well, let me just say it's been my pleasure to provide the assist here for Vivienne this evening. So please join us in raising a glass to our literary lights, past and present, to the special collections, and to the library.
Thank
Cheers.
you all. Thank you all for coming, and please feel free to linger on. We're having much too good a time to go home. Thank you.